much for coming and for staying and for waiting for us. Okay, so there is a tectonic shift in the norms of doing business, led by European regulation, and it is already affecting and going to affect more further the global trade in general and Israel foreign trade in particular. Any Israeli business in the value chain of EU business is going to be affected. However, we don't see much awareness in the Israeli market to these upcoming changes, and we see even less preparation. In this webinar, we invited Mr. Bogdan Gecić, my colleague and EU law expert, to explain some of the new EU regulations regarding sustainability, ESG, and carbon. Well, when I was preparing this short intro, I ran into this old cartoon of the New Yorker that says pretty much everything in a short sentence. It says, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And that, in a nutshell, is what the EU regulation is trying to cope with. Because what it's trying to do is to cope with the gap between creating value to shareholders and harming or diminishing the other values for other stakeholders. So just before we talk regulation, maybe a few sentences about what climate change is. So we are now finishing a very long hot summer. If you were in Europe, you could have felt heat waves in places where they usually don't even use any air condition at all. In the UK, there were severe heat waves that caused airplane tracks to melt down and put out of use. There were fire blazes in forests around France, Spain, Greece, and water reservoirs that just got dry completely, and we have only just begun. Now winter is coming. And
I'm sorry, Galit, your presentation is not on the mode.
Okay, but I'm not sure I can change this, Aviv. What do you see?
It's just the first.
Okay, now it's good.
Now it's good?
We see.
Do you see NOAA state of climate?
Right now we see that, yes, but it's not passing when you're not.
Okay. And now?
We see like this slide and the next one.
Yeah, this I cannot change, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine, but this is okay.
Okay, so this is the NOAA state of climate anomalies. NOAA is the US agency for weather forecast, and it publishes a monthly report of the climate anomalies and events worldwide. So you can see this is October 2022, it's the last one, and you can see hurricanes near Mexico, tropical storms in the Philippines, and rainfalls in Australia. And this is the warmest October ever in Europe. Do you see the other one now?
Yes.
You see? Okay, so basically, I'm not going to give you the whole lecture of what climate change is, but basically what does happen is that what human activities release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than what natural processes can remove. And therefore, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing yearly. And the global average carbon dioxide for year 2021 has set new record high of 415 parts per million. This means that it grows like it's like the annual rate of increase is in the past 60 years is about 100 times faster than what it was in ancient times. Basically, so again, this is not a climate lecture, but what we need to know is that we do have what the activities that people do does change the climate. And so approximately 3 to 6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. So what do? We need to reduce emissions of CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases. This is the GHG protocol that we know, and Paris Agreement, which was maybe the most important updated times agreement between it was ratified by 199 countries. The main aim of it is to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions such that the total global rise in temperature will be well below 2%, 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 Celsius degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Well, we're not there. Up to date, the emissions gap is that we are in 20 to 23 gigaton of CO2 gap between what we should have been and what we need to be. And maybe this is the most important thing, is that this is why we have all the regulation that is coming to change the Paris Agreement, the state of this, the gap between emissions that we should have been in or where we are now. So now that I got your attention about all the problems and scared you, you may be more comfortable with the ongoing regulation that is growing and the pressure over polluters and over the industry. What I just wanted to emphasize more is what it has to do with us, with Israeli companies. So Israel is EU's 24th biggest trade partner, representing almost 1% of the EU's total trade in goods in 2020. What may be more important is that the EU is Israel's biggest trade partner, accounting for almost 30% of its trade in goods in 2020. And this is why we are there, why it's important for us. Basically, this is what Bogdan was going to talk about it a little bit more, but it all comes down to the value chain. If I'm an Israeli business and I'm in the supply chain of an EU business that has to comply with any of the directives of the European directives regarding reducing emissions, then I'm in, because this business, the EU business, must report also as an Israeli business, my GHG, my greenhouse gases emissions as part of the EU business scope 3. And so this is just a little map of the scope 3 reports that are around the world. It's not only the EU. We are talking about EU today, but also pay attention that also in the US, registered companies have to comply with the new SEC rules that require reporting scope 3, and also in the UK and in Singapore and in many other countries. It's just spreading around. Last thing that is, because I'm a lawyer, maybe some of you are as well, and you maybe remember the SFDR, the GDPR 4 or 5 years ago. It's been a big trouble around the GDPR, and again, people didn't even know how they would be affected. So it's going to affect as well. The SFDR is the new GDPR because it has extraterritorial jurisprudence, because it is automatically applied because it's a regulation and not a directive. And it's going to be effective because it's upstream and downstream applications through the value chain, just as we said here. Maybe it's not the same because you need to be able to prepare to it, because you wouldn't be able to be prepared to it by automatically clicking or doing some kind of a disclaimer like we did with the GDPR. We need a little bit more preparation, and this leads me to Bogdan's presentation that we dive deep inside this regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Galit, very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Bogdan. It's really a pleasure to see you all. And for this little chat that we're going to have now, just give me a little second so that I can actually share my PowerPoint. Okay, this is too far away. This is where we're going to start from. Okay, so there's a couple of things before we kick off with the more nitty-gritty details. As Galit mentioned, I mean, when we talk about ESG, first of all, ESG is probably a very, frankly, dumb name. It's a typical acronym, like, you know, all of the legal acronyms that we lawyers come up with, and then we bug business, because essentially it's CSR that all of you know, plus environment. And essentially why we have such a big fuss about ESG is because of environment. All of the other things we had for decades, and all of you are pretty much used to it. But the E bit in the ESG is the key one. And that's what Galit was mentioning about climate change. I mean, there's again a couple of points. Of course, there's one which is purely scientific. For people who believed in science, I think that one was here with us for the last 20 years. There's another one which is ethical, where you just have a mood shift, especially in the West, when it comes to climate change. And the third one is purely business, meaning that if your consumers change their policy or moral expectations, you as a business need to adapt. Full stop, irrespective of whether you agree, like it or not, and so forth. In terms of how things are going currently, we do have the global framework for combating climate change with the targets that Galit mentioned. Unfortunately, there's a very big question whether in practice this will work, because enforcement mechanisms are extremely weak. We have a couple of jurisdictions that are more advanced when it comes to questions of ESG. One of them is the US. However, in the US, and I'm sure that you guys have been following this, it's still a heavily politicized topic. So you have the federal level pushing for ESG and the SEC, but then you have states like Texas who are issuing fines against so-called greenwashing. And BlackRock and others actually had to pull out because they had ESG requirements. Then we have the big giants in Asia who have a completely different approach to ESG, because they deem that they were the last to join the industrial transition, and therefore they should not be the ones paying the most when it comes to transfer to green and clean technology. And in the middle of this, we have the Europeans, who still have the largest market on the globe, and they intend to leverage this in a way that if you want to do trade with Europe, if you want to sell your goods in Europe, you need to comply with the EU standards. As Galit mentioned, the GDPR, the data privacy regulation, was one of the key things a few years back. What the EU did, they relied on something that in science we call the Brussels effect, which is essentially just them leveraging that they're that big, and that if you want to do trade with them, they don't have a legal sanction, but they have a factual one that they can block trade. And that's why then everybody, including big tech, adopted GDPR rules, and it became a global golden standard. Now, this is what the union is trying to do with something that they call the Green Deal. So as you can imagine, they love Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because they're trying to, you know, mimic the Great Deal that put an end to depression. Now they're trying to do the same with environmental issues. And the Green Deal is essentially a big legislative project that the European Commission is spearheading for the last few years. Unfortunately, other global events have slowed them down. First it was COVID, now it's the war in Ukraine. However, it did slow them down, but it didn't deter them. So they had these regulations in the pipeline for a very long time. And they finally, this year, this fall, they have been adopting one by one. Essentially, these key topics, I've mentioned this in my short intro. Why is this important for Israeli and essentially any third country importers into the EU? Anyone who's involved in the supply chain with EU companies? Because if you're not compliant, you will be effectively blocked from doing business in the EU market. That's the key leverage. It's not, you know, whether you have a stance on environmental protection or not, what's your policy like. they will just effectively, with these new regs, they will block you. And the timeline is very, very impressive, because although, you know, the phase in will happen gradually. So for those reporting obligations under the new directive, it will kick off only in January 2024. But when you see how much you have to do in terms of compliance, 2024 is actually tomorrow. The other new carbon imports tax is coming even sooner. The last that we know of from yesterday actually is that it will kick off as of October 2023, which is only in 9 months from now. So it's literally tomorrow. And what we expect, so these are the key three new regs or new pieces of legislation that the EU is adopting. Actually, the third one, the CBAM, is a regulation. The other two are directives. The key difference under EU law is because the Union is a very special animal. It's not a country, but it's not anymore a typical international organization. So regulations are types of legislation that apply directly. Directives are legislation that require member states, meaning Spain, Hungary, France, to adopt their own national legislation. The first two pieces of legislation, they're directives, and that's why you have a little bit of a longer deadline, which is usually up to 2 years, and in this case it is. The third one, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is a regulation, so it will apply directly, and it will kick off in as of 1st of October 2023. And now let's go one by one. So the Sustainability Reporting Directive, I don't know how many of you remember, but I'm sure that you do. So when, first of all, you remember all of the incidents in Wall Street that then led to significantly more robust insider trading disclosure obligations when you do any business with SEC listed, New York Stock Exchange listed companies. And the other one is, of course, the Panama Papers, when they happened, the AML and UBO registries and the whole change in compliance that triggered. So essentially, that's what will happen with this directive, but it will be for environmental issues. And when it comes to sustainability reporting, it will not be only for environmental issues. It will actually have, in some aspects, also the other S&G, meaning, for example, what type of labor do you use, and some other issues that can be a big problem, not for you guys, but for example, for producers coming from Asia and for supply chains from Asia. But let's go one by one. So the newest thing, it was approved literally last month. It will start applying in January 2024. It will require a very robust and extensive compliance exercise in each respective company. And frankly, without any intention to scare you guys, it would make perfect sense to start literally now, because the level of compliance and the level of due diligence and everything that you'll have to do in your own companies, if you're exporting to the EU, especially if you fall under the bracket of the third of these three bullets that you have under the scope section. So if you can see non-EU companies with EU revenue, which is above 150 million per year, with a branch subsidiary in the EU. If you have a company that falls under this bracket, and I imagine that a number of them do, then you should start literally tomorrow to prepare for this. In other cases, it depends on where you are in the supply chain, whether you are a member of a consolidated group that's doing business in the EU, and a number of other criteria. But this last one that I mentioned, that one is, let's say, at this point, of biggest interest to any foreign companies that are doing business in the EU. And of course, if you're a listed company, then this triggers obligations immediately, except if you're a micro enterprise. A micro enterprise is very tiny. And I think it doesn't mostly apply to anyone, at least on this call. So in any event, there is a very high likelihood that your company might be subject to the new directive. If that's the case, then extensive compliance and due diligence is necessary. You also need to do it not only vis-a-vis your own company, but also vis-a-vis the suppliers that you use to make, for example, derivative products and then ship them further to the EU. And there will be certified auditing obligations. So what we expect is that you will very quickly see a explosion in the market with service providers offering these audits, offering certified reviews, offering due diligences. There will be all sorts of issues like we saw with AML, with UBO issues, where you would have questions of whether you can use the same provider to do the due diligence as the one that's actually issuing a certified audit. It will be very, I think, initially in the first 2 years, messy, to be honest. And there will be a lot of trial and error, even vis-a-vis the European Commission. Because, I mean, imagine for everyone, as much as, and the European Commission really has high quality services, meaning they employ very skilled civil servants. But even with that, this is completely new. This is a revolutionary mechanism. And it will take them a lot to, I think, start applying this in a uniform way. So the so-called EFRAG is something else that I would, and you have a little link, and we'll share the presentation after the webinar, that I would advise all of you to have a look, because it gives you the standards that the EU will be requesting from each company, including the so-called taxonomy. The taxonomy is essentially a classification of various concepts and standards that the EU expects a company to apply if part of the supply chain that eventually ends up in the EU. As I mentioned, because this is a directive, this will have to be introduced into local law, and enforcement will be coordinated between the European Commission and local level. Frankly, and I can't say this completely publicly, but I'm not a big fan of directives, because what this means in practice, since you have 27 member states in the Union, it means that once you have a directive, you have 27 parliaments and governments deciding on how to introduce them into their local law. And as you can imagine, when you have 27 of them, the probability of someone doing something differently than someone else increases exponentially. So we might have, and I expect, that alignment and uniformity between provisions that, for example, France introduces vis-a-vis Poland will be initially really big. And there will be a lot of technical and legal issues. For those of you who have more exposure with EU law, how this is solved is that eventually you will have member states, meaning, for example, Belgium, asking questions about how to apply the directive from the highest court in Europe, in Luxembourg, the ECJ. And I think we'll have a lot of this going on with this directive. What we've seen from clients and partners is that there is considerable concern, because everybody's understanding that this will have a very high toll on initially on their compliance procedures in the companies. We'll see what happens. I mean, at this point, except a few countries that are explicitly sanctioned by the EU, everyone else does business with the EU. And pretty much there's no jurisdiction that doesn't import into the EU. Israel actually has really high numbers, as you saw. Galit showed you, I think, a third of all trade that Israel does is with the EU. So just imagine if you had the threat of a sanction of 30% of your revenue, to make it, just to give you a plastic figure. So in that sense, I think that it will definitely move businesses to comply, and it will be a lot of work. And similarly, like the GDPR, I think the learning curve will be very steep initially, but then once you establish all of the mechanisms, it will then be pretty much steady sailing afterwards. At least that's what we expect when it comes to the directive. The other part of this reporting obligation is the due diligence directive. So one is how you report on sustainability issues. The other one is how you do your own due diligence in the company, and how you integrate ESG requirements into your own corporate strategy, which means that it will also change the way how a company does due diligences. This will kick in, we believe at least that it will be applied a little bit later, but it will definitely be adopted by February. Sorry, it was adopted by February 2022. It will apply a little bit later because as I mentioned, as a directive, it needs to be introduced in each of the 27 countries. But once it happens, it will considerably change also how we do due diligences and how we do M&As. When I mentioned, for example, that I don't perceive this affecting that much Israeli businesses, but it will affect Israeli businesses in the sense that if you are part of a supply chain that comes from Asia. So one of the things that the European Commission was very openly discussing, and here it's not only environmental issues, it's also social issues, meaning human rights issues, for example, forced child labor. That will be one of the key topics that we heard about. Essentially, if you are buying any goods in the supply chain that are coming from a jurisdiction where there is indication that these goods were produced by use of forced child labor, that will be a huge red flag. And it might actually be a problem then to further export these goods into another country. So that's something that we definitely, that you'll have to pay attention to. And again, what the European Commission is counting on is exactly that this will have a spillover effect. So even in jurisdictions like Israel, where this is not an issue, meaning forced child labor, the fact that you might be buying goods and being part of a supply chain from Asia or Africa, where this might be the case, will then essentially move your company into a position where you need to do the due diligence of what you're buying before you can then further export it into the EU. And in that way, the European Commission is hoping that it will make a spillover effect, so that although none of these jurisdictions in Asia and Africa have these rules, that in practice, they will have to start to apply them so that they can do business, continue to do business and be part of the supply chain. And that's the interesting bit. The other is the environmental part, where, for example, if goods are coming from a jurisdiction in which there's no environmental rules, or if there's even something worse, an environmental catastrophe. And we had that, and this was a case that was handled by the SEC in the States of a Brazil dam that exploded. So in any event that you have something that's extremely harmful to the environment, either in terms of a catastrophe or in terms of extensive CO2 emissions and footprint without any carbon tax, that too will have to be identified in a due diligence and disclosed. As you can imagine, this will make very considerable due diligence obligations for companies, and it will be actually very expensive to implement. However, what the European Commission and the EU expects is that the companies will be doing a trade-off. And the trade-off will be, okay, how much do I gain from doing business in the EU versus the costs of not applying this directive? And whoever still has a margin, even with introducing all of this, they eventually will. Plus, what the European Commission is also counting on is consumer support, because they have been publicly, very strongly doing a PR initiative for this whole directive, so that they garner public support, and that your average consumer then also wants to know whether the product that is offered to them was produced in a way that's compliant with the ESG standards. If you remember, for example, and if you've been exposed to organic certificates for food, this is pretty much similar how the European Commission is planning to do it. So, you know, it will have to have a stamp. It will have to say, okay, this was ESG compliant. And the Commission is planning a number of advocacy initiatives. And they pretty much expect that in 10 years' time, your average EU consumer will, he or she or they themselves will be extremely aware of whether a product is ESG compliant or not, and they will be making their consumer choices based on this. The Europeans, by the way, they kicked off relatively early on when it comes to the whole green gas emissions issue. And the Europeans have a very sophisticated tax system in place as of 2005. So for the last 16 years, almost 17. So they are already used to these issues. And the idea is that their consumers are already highly supportive of this. That's why, unlike the global compact, the EU actually is targeting for a reduction in emissions by 55% by 2030. This also led to a very funny and unpleasant situation for the European Commission, because then they decided to call the campaign Fit for 55. And the current commission is very gender equal. And then there was a lot of newsmen who actually thought that it was inappropriate to call a campaign Fit for 55. So then the commission in the very last minute had to drop that name and just go with the green agenda, the Green Deal. But you can still, when you look this up, you can find also references to the Fit for 55 hashtags in this one. But that's the rationale, that they're aiming to make a drop of 55 based on calculations that the commission did, because you also need to remember something. Generally, the union has a very robust public consultation process when they're adopting any kind of legislation, especially this revolutionary. Usually it takes 1 to 2 years for them. So they kick off with a white paper, which is a paper just outlining their ideas for new legislation. Then they invite all interested parties, meaning countries, companies, trade associations, to provide their comments. Then it goes through 3 institutions: the European Commission, the Council, which is the body that represents all of the member states, and the Parliament, which are the MEPs who are directly elected. And only after all of this, these pieces of legislation get adopted. So they're extensively in the public domain. And that's also how the European Commission believes that they achieve 2 objectives. One is that they get stakeholder support and credibility, because they've given everyone a right to be involved when this was being adopted. And the other is that they raise awareness because they try to make a lot of noise about such a big piece of legislation way up front, so that they hope that businesses would be ready. Unfortunately, in practice, Brussels operates as a bubble. So if you don't have a trade representative, a rep office, or you're part of a trade association in Brussels, there's very high likelihood that you won't hear about any of this, even after 2 years. And then your company just gets shocked and surprised that all of a sudden you have all of this legal and compliance stuff that you need to do, and in a relatively short time span. But let's get back to the scope, because I think that's key, and you'll see that this scope is very close to the one in the reporting directive, because the logic that the Commission is aiming for and the targets are pretty much the same. So if your company falls under any of these, then you need to start to prepare for the sustainability due diligence. I'll just give you a second so that you can skim through them, but you'll have all of this in the presentation that we'll share afterwards. And with these two directives, as I said, you'll have a little bit more time. So on average, 1 to 2 years from now, to get ready and to see how this is implemented. A very big task will be for each individual company to map out the specific countries in the European Union that you do business with, because as I said, all 27 will be implementing these two directives, which means that all 27 will have different national laws. And the devil is always in the detail. So there's a very big chance that in these 27 multiplied by two directives, we're talking about 54 pieces of legislation. And if you're doing business in more than one country in the EU, that will be a lot of work for you just to pick up this without, adjusting to all of the requirements under the two directives. Now we're coming to the third bit, which is the union's probably most bold child of them all, because of course it has a very Brussels type of well, I wanted to say stupid, but I imagine that that's not appropriate. But that kind of a name, so it's a very lengthy and boring name that goes carbon border adjustment mechanism. Essentially, what this is a carbon tariff, a carbon tax. So what the EU is planning to do, and what they've adopted already, and this one is the most revolutionary piece of legislation out of the three, because this never existed before in any legal system on the planet. So this is the first time ever that a jurisdiction, meaning the European Union, is adopting a unilateral piece of legislation, essentially a tariff, a border tariff, that would tax CO2 emissions. And so this was adopted, the final piece was agreed only 2 nights ago. We do have the text, and we have a clear understanding of what will be hit initially. So all of you who do business in steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, and electricity, and to a certain extent in hydro, you should start doing the math, because very quickly, if you're exporting into the EU, you will be facing a tax on the border. If not a tax, you will be facing a tax procedure on the border. What this means is that you will have to show the exact amount of emissions per ton that your company produces in your specific sectors. And you will need to show whether you paid any carbon tax in Israel or not. And then the European Commission will decide whether this is equal to how much European industry, meaning EU industry, is paying. And if the European Commission, in its ultimate wisdom, decides that this is not equal, you will be taxed the difference on the border. The rationale for this is, and if you recall, I mentioned this at the beginning, that the EU has been applying a special carbon tax as of 2005. So the European Commission believes, rightly so, that its industry has higher costs of doing business in the EU compared to any importers. And there is a concern that for highly advanced economies or economies which are very close to the EU in terms of proximity, like, for example, the Western Balkans, that they have an advantage compared to EU companies, because in most of these jurisdictions, there is no carbon tax. So, and what the European Commission identified is that there's something that they called carbon leakage. Why carbon leakage? Because they essentially are trying to say that companies are leaking out of the EU into either sophisticated jurisdictions like Israel or jurisdictions which are very close by to the EU, like the Western Balkans, because of a more lenient carbon tax system in place compared to the one that the EU has. And the EU now wants to bring this to how they call it, a level playing field. So make everyone equal by doing what? By introducing a tax that would then essentially adjust the price difference for the missing carbon tax at the national level of a specific country. Of course, because this is such a revolutionary piece of legislation. I mean, this is something that was done in international trade for the very first time. There is a very big chance that a number of countries will challenge this in the World Trade Organization. There's a lot of talk whether this is even compliant with WTO rules. But as I'm sure many of you know, I mean, a WTO challenge lasts almost for a decade. So by then, and I think this is the gambit that the European Commission is counting on, that by then it won't be that relevant, whether it turns out that some parts of the CBAM are not compliant with the WTO, because by then everybody will align themselves with the WTO. As you can imagine, there are extensive negotiations in the background with the US, because this will also hit US importers into the EU. This will also hit everyone who's doing business with someone who's eventually importing into the EU, because the CBAM will again have a trickle down or spillover effect. So for example, if you guys are doing business with someone in the States or someone in a third country, but then from there, the goods in the supply chain are being exported into the EU, they will be hit with a tax if they don't have a carbon tax. Of course, then what will happen in that jurisdiction, it will gradually align and introduce most probably a carbon tax. So your business is exporting into that third country, let's say, for example, Turkey, might be then hit by a tax. So the European Commission is again counting on a network effect, a spillover effect, that once, you know, the country of final origin of an export starts feeling the pain of the CBAM, that they will then start aligning with the carbon tax, and that in turn will then affect the whole supply chain. So this one, for example, shows the Western Balkans, where we are in terms of trade, and Galit showed you, of course, where Israel is. All of the countries that do extensive trade with the EU will be severely hit. So just to give you some numbers, and you can check this online, the current European tax per ton on carbon, it's called the ETS carbon price, is between 88 and 90 euros per ton of CO2. So effectively, if we do the numbers currently, and we use, for example, 1 billion euros of export, currently, if there's no carbon tax in place in a specific country that's exporting into the EU, there is the average tax based on the model that was adopted 2 nights ago is between 27, 8% and 30%. So on 1 billion of exports, you would be paying almost 300 million of tax. So as you can imagine, these are huge numbers. And what we expect is that this will considerably change the way how businesses are trading with the EU. Of course, the EU they're doing this again in a transitional, gradual phasing in type of a way. So initially, companies will only have a duty of reporting. Reporting will kick off as of October 2023. However, reporting again, although it sounds simple, like the other 2 directives, it's actually going to be quite sophisticated, because you will have to have a national system of certified audits. And Galit, on that point, I must confess, I'm not aware how far Israel got in terms of certified audits for emissions.
Actually, we don't have any certified audits for emissions in Israel. All the mechanisms here are voluntary. There is a new voluntary mechanism just a month ago that the Ministry of Environmental Protection in Israel just published for businesses, but it's in the making. They just published it a month ago in the COP27 during
Okay.
Yes. It's
Okay,
voluntary.
so that's really great news. I mean, but kidding aside, that means that actually everyone who's on this call should definitely go and discuss with their trade associations ASAP, because you then need to heavily lobby. You will need legislation in 9 months' time, because if there isn't a certified audit mechanism, what will happen to each company that's on this call and generally from Israel is that once they come to the border with the EU and they knock on the door, like a typical customs declaration, they will need to show a declaration of their emissions, which needs to be certified, because nobody will trust anyone by saying, who claims that this is your level of emission? I do. Instead, it will need a certified audit. If you don't have one, the European Commission devised a really nice way of establishing your customs base, let's say your tax base, essentially, based on which they will then calculate the tariff. The way how this will be done is they will take the average based on Eurostat, so based on the EU's data, they will take the average of the 10 worst polluters in Israel, and the average number, meaning CO2 per ton, will be used as a baseline for any Israeli company exporting into the EU. Which means that companies which are actually more ESG friendly will be taxed unfairly a lot more than their actual CO2 footprint. And that's why it's key that everybody starts working on this legislation so that you have certified audits by October. And we see this in a number of jurisdictions where we practice. So we cover now 5 jurisdictions as a firm, and in these jurisdictions there is no legislation, and most of them there's no even awareness that this is happening. We do have a couple of trade associations which have been following this and have been trying to warn their members, but I think unfortunately that if people don't start and businesses understanding how serious this is and how quickly it will come, they will be unpleasantly surprised at the border with the EU come October. Because come October, and there's a hook how the European Commission will do this. It will be, they will essentially say, okay, but it's not our fault that you haven't adopted a monitoring system in your own country. We asked you, you didn't provide anything. And, we don't have a way how to calculate your CO2 footprint individually. So the only thing that we can do is use the numbers that we have, and that's the 10 worst polluters, and do an average. And based on that, you'll pay a 25% tax. And voila. Of course, the tax obligation will not kick in automatically. Instead, it will take a couple of years. And for different sectors, the transitional periods will be different, but the monitoring will kick off already as of October. And it will probably last, based on the latest piece of legislation that we saw, it will probably last for 3 years before they actually start tariffing companies. However, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get out of the tax base that is established for an individual company based on the data that the company was providing during the monitoring. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that if you don't have a monitoring system in place in your country, or if your numbers are really bad for, let's say, 2 years, it will be very difficult for you then to change this later on when the tariff starts. The European Commission will take your data or the lack of your data as a basis for the tariff. And then the onus of the job, the burden of proof to show that your numbers are now different than they were in the monitoring period will be exclusively on the company. And what we expect, it will be relatively difficult to change it. So it's crucial that trade associations and individual companies lobby their respective governments to be ready for October. Especially when we talk about countries that have these specific relations with the EU. So all of the Western Balkans have association agreements, and they're in a trade association with the EU. Israel is also one of the countries that have this special association agreement. People take these agreements lightly, but essentially these are very specific free trade agreements plus. And they are not only part of national laws in the countries that signed this with the EU, but because the EU ratified them, they're also part of European law. There's even in Europe a section of legal research that calls this EU association law. And there's a lot of even case law affirming primacy of EU association law. Why is all of this important? Because this is, again, a venue in which trade association and companies with their government can lobby the European Commission to discuss how a country can be exempted from the CBAM, or how a country can at least have a lower tariff when it comes to the CBAM. And why I'm saying all of this is, and I missed to mention this because I was focusing more on monitoring. If a country has a carbon tax system in place, then it will have to prove to the European Commission that its tax system in economic effects is close or equal to what the European Union has. And this needs to be done through negotiations. If you're an association country like Israel is, then you do it through the Association Council, which is a council where all 27 EU member states sit, the European Commission sits, and of course, Israel and Israeli businesses. So there is a lot of space that if people start early, and frankly, starting now is not early anymore. Early was a year and a half ago. Now it's pretty much last minute. If businesses and trade associations start early, there's a chance that Israel can get a better treatment vis-a-vis the EU when it comes to the CBAM. But for that, a monitoring system needs to be eventually in place. A carbon tax needs to be eventually in place. And there is an additional very interesting bit. Once a country starts adopting a carbon tax of its own, then it and its industry will be subject to carbon leakage. But why? Because then its industry will be less competitive compared to importers from third countries that don't have a tax. So then what happens is that that country will very quickly start devising its own CBAM. And this is not a theoretical concept. This is actually what the UK is doing. So the UK, being extremely close to the EU, but not a member state anymore, doing extensive trade with the EU, is having a similar issue. The UK now, and it still has its own ETS, its own carbon tax in place. The UK is now very close to adopting its own CBAM. So, for example, Israeli businesses that are exporting into the UK, in addition to the EU, will be faced with a CBAM in the UK. As I said, I mean, this is really a revolutionary part of a piece of legislation. We don't even know what to expect, because it will revamp the whole carbon law state of affairs globally. And what we understand from the European Commission, the CBAM will be used as a tool to spearhead developments with regard to the other two directives, because the CBAM will come first. It will strongly push economically and legally for introduction of a carbon tax, and that will then very nicely play in with the requirements under the two directives, the due diligence one and the reporting one. And that's why the Commission has been adopting this all together, because it's all part of a bigger package and a bigger system that they're trying to impose on the globe. Because essentially, whoever does trade with the European Union will have to comply. Just wanted to show you very quickly. So all of these green jurisdictions and the red ones that you see, these are in the European Union, or at least part of Europe, who have association agreements like Israel with the EU, and who have these very special relations with the EU. All of these jurisdictions heavily, except Turkey, who is diversified, everyone else heavily trades with the EU. The numbers are significantly higher than Israel. So Israel is around 30%. Ukraine, the Western Balkans, meaning Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, all of these jurisdictions, they trade almost 80% with the EU, which means that the EU has immense leverage, and irrespective of whether a country supports, is ready, can actually have the capacity to adopt a carbon tax, to adopt a sustainability reporting system or a due diligence system, it has no choice. Because if it doesn't, being all of these are relatively small countries that live off exports, and that's pretty much as I understand the Israeli economy, very similar to you guys. You actually make a very big part of your GDP based on exports. Because the local market is just not big enough. In that sense, if you're doing it with the EU, you will have to agree with EU rules. And as I said, by the way, doctrine and generally policymakers in Brussels call this the Brussels effect, that if you want to do business with the EU, you will have to adopt its rules. When it comes to this region, 70% of all trade, as I said, 70–80% depends on a specific year, is connected exclusively with the EU. And that's why, for example, all of these jurisdictions, for all three pieces of this legislation, they will all be adopting them. And just to tell you a funny story, whether any of them is ready for this, none of them are ready. As I said, and not only for the CBAM, they're not ready for the other two directives either. There's almost little awareness. Only in the last 3 months, we had a couple of trade association conferences and people started talking about ESG. So essentially, in my take, there's some 18 months late compared to where they would have to be in order to be ready when this legislation kicks off. It will be an immense amount of work for companies. And if you're not ready, you will effectively be taxed, whether it will be a literal tax in terms of a carbon tax on the border, or taxed in terms of not being able to do business or pay a lot more for your due diligence or for your reporting. It's frankly irrelevant. It will be a big cost for business. So my message is, get ready, invest now, because you will save considerably in the future. And just a few more things. This is just a snapshot of how things look like in general, because in addition to all of this that the EU is adopting, as I said, the US is doing its own thing. The most impressive US development in terms of legislation is going on. Oh, sorry, I just noticed the question. I do apologize. Do you want me to give me just a few minutes just to finish this, and I'll then return to the questions? Okay, so the US is doing its push through the SEC. So the SEC is now trying to reinterpret its own financial reporting rules in a way that you would need to include ESG consideration. And the SEC is also trying to tackle a relatively new phenomenon that's called greenwashing, which means that your company claims to be environmentally friendly, compliant, but effectively when you do the numbers, you see that that's can be farther from the truth. The SEC started issuing a couple of fines recently. It has also started asking companies to have full ESG disclosures. This is also a trend we see with banks. And this is something that I failed to mention when we were talking about these three pieces of legislation, because it's not directly part of the three pieces of legislation, but it's essentially it comes from the same kitchen. The European Central Bank, which is the monetary institution of the EU, is now requesting individual business banks to also have ESG reporting, which in turn will mean that if you're doing business in the EU, meaning any financial banking and finance transactions, any kind of operations, you will be also subject to the bank's ESG reporting. So the union is really coming in strong, and this was all planned to happen pre-COVID. So they actually are running late for some 2 years, but they will definitely now in the next 2 years try to implement everything that they had in the pipeline. And these three pieces of legislation are the first to come. And always remember, when I say three pieces of legislation, it's actually CBAM is one, and then these other two you multiply by 27. So you have 55. Yeah, that's funny, like fifth for 55. You have 55 pieces of legislation if you want to do business in all of the European Union. And if not, you will have to do a multi-jurisdictional assessment if you want to do, for example, 3 countries. Okay, on that note, I'll stop and I'll get back to the question of ensuring food security. Okay, so that's a fantastic question. Yes, when it comes to the 2 directives, it will apply to all sectors. When it comes to the CBAM will apply to those 5 sectors that I mentioned, and for now, only to a few derived products. What we know is that the European Union is planning to expand this list and eventually include all derivative products. So any product that uses aluminum, steel, plastic, and whatnot. But that will come probably in some 5 years' time. At this point, they're first hitting, and they're hitting strongly, the big key sectors when it comes to the CBAM. When it comes to the 2 directives, it will definitely apply to all sectors. And on that note, by the way, if anyone has any questions or Galit, if you have first any
Yeah.
comments, please.
Bogdan, I just wanted to maybe to summarize or to wrap up everything just with our recommendations before we go into the questions. And what we're saying to the Israeli importers, exporters, suppliers, or any other business in the value chain is that you don't wait for it. You just need to take the initiative and work for having an ESG report of yourselves, the carbon footprint of yourselves. We also recommend to gather information on the partner, client, investor in the EU, and just check their own ESG reports and see what they report and what is essential for them. We recommend to learn the language and the keywords. What we try to do here, and it was a fantastic presentation, Bogdan, but I think that we need that the client or the business has to learn the language. It's part of it, and take focus on the material issues, maybe if not everything, the CO2 emissions reduction, diversity and inclusion, ethical issues, waste, energy efficiency, hazardous materials, labor issues. These are what we believe to be essential issues that they needs to be addressed and take part, and the business has to work on reporting and taking care of these issues. That's what I wanted to add.
No, Galit, thank you. I mean, that's a very good point. Essentially, what everyone will have to do is, well, download these directives, either through professional advisors or do it in-house, but they will have to then map out the directives, make a very clear structure of the taxonomy, meaning all of the terms and concepts, the language, and then start issue spotting, essentially seeing what of these issues that are being regulated under these new directives apply directly to their business. And then, start from there. And it will be a very steep learning curve process initially, but it's a must. I think if otherwise, it will be highly problematic to do business in some 9 to 18 months time from now. And sorry, we also have a question: how much CSR reporting is needed? Well, the quick and short answer is a lot. I think compared to what you have now, it's a new universe, to be quite honest. Okay, so Baruch, we have for medium companies with below 150 euros exports, seems that the scope of the directives do not apply at this point. If so, when is it expected? Well, it doesn't apply at this point, especially doesn't apply if you're a micro company. We don't think that initially this will be expected, frankly, because it will take time for the big players to align. And what we know from the public consultations is that the European Commission is counting that the big players will in turn align the smaller businesses. How? Because usually the big players use a number of smaller suppliers. Since the big players will have to be compliant with these directives, they will require the same from their smaller suppliers. So although your company will not be directly affected if it doesn't meet the thresholds, if it's doing business with a big company, it will have these requirements from its buyers. So effectively, you'll get into the same situation. It's just not that the European Commission will be enforcing this against you, but instead it will be your big buyer.
It's what we call the soft regulation. It's a chain reaction.
Exactly.
Once a business, an EU business, is one of your clients or suppliers, then you will have to address the same regulation.
Okay, so Stephanie's asking, I think this one, Galit, is more for you.
So Stephanie is asking, with which certifying body would you suggest that Israeli companies start preparing? So as I said, there is no certifying body. I mean, there is no mandatory auditing body nowadays. And actually, this is a very good question because the Israeli Ministry of Environmental Protection has just published a mechanism and some standard rules for doing carbon footprint and doing what they call a net zero process. But still, there is no certifying body in Israel. It's in the making. It's going to happen very soon. It will be. This is what is going to be the next the 2023. I don't know, not the trend, but this is where this is one of the processes that the Israeli market is going through. So up to now, there is no such, but there are some voluntary bodies, and of course we have Shibolet ESG. So I must say that we are we do a lot of helping to such businesses, and there are some others that do this that help with having a carbon footprint report or a scope 3 emissions report.
Galit, can I jump in? So Stephanie, Galit is too humble, and I don't have to be because I'm not from the same country. So first of all, you definitely need to start doing it voluntarily until there's a certified body in place, because then you do the brunt of the work, because there's a lot of technical, nitty-gritty work that it needs to be done. And frankly, in our experience and everything that we've seen, because we've been doing with this with a number of jurisdictions and preparing a number of clients, there is no equal in our experience to what Shibolet can offer when it comes to ESG in Israel, to be quite honest.
Thank you.
As I said, Galit is humble, but I don't have to be. Okay, so does anyone have anything else? Please shoot whatever questions. We're more than happy to discuss.
So Shmuel is asking what impacts of COVID-19 pandemic and post-COVID era on implementation those new regulations. Shmuel.
Not much. So Shmuel, that's a really good question. Not much, frankly. Why? The most that we got from COVID was the postponement of this legislation. The European Union addressed the COVID issue in a different way. They adopted back in March 2020 something that's called the temporary state aid framework, because the EU has a completely separate piece of legislation, which again doesn't exist anywhere else on the globe, that's called state aid law, and where they essentially control the level of all sorts of subsidies, meaning even cases where a public authority decides to relinquish some of its revenue. So for example, if it lowers taxes or whatnot, the Brussels controls this on a central level. So what this means in practice is your Lufthansa, you're a German company, the German government gives you aid to bail you out because you were hit by COVID. Brussels needs to approve it. Why? Because it's affecting the whole single market of the EU. So what the EU did, because these rules are very strict, very robust, and they limit individual countries' abilities to give subsidies. During COVID, the European Union adopted a extremely complex mechanism that allowed for a lot more state aid to be granted to individual companies during COVID. That's actually now phasing out. The last really important bits of it will phase out by end of this year, and there will be a very small part of this legislation still in force next year until 2023. In parallel, however, what happened, and this might be interesting for you guys, is that the European Commission adopted this year a new temporary framework, again relaxing state aid rules, but now because of the Ukrainian crisis. Because of course, what the war in Ukraine did, it affected energy supply significantly, and energy costs have went, through the rooftop. So in that sense, That's a big change that now, again, EU companies or even companies that are doing business in the EU can be granted state aid if they've been hit by the Ukrainian war. Okay, so we have another one from Stephanie. Could EU certified bodies help? Well, they definitely can. And there's a lot of work going on in Brussels in that sense, but they cannot do it on their own, Stephanie. Why? Because first, the European Union has, as I mentioned, a very sophisticated carbon tax system in place that again uses a typical Brussels name. It's called ETS. It's an acronym for emission trading system, which again doesn't tell you much. So back to what Galit was saying about the language, but essentially what it is, it's a special carbon, let's call it credit tax system, where you can trade with these credits on a stock exchange. And this is what the EU has had in place for now almost 17 years. So companies that do advisory work in the EU are completely used to the ETS. Most probably countries like Israel and like, for example, the Western Balkans or Ukraine won't be adopting a ETS immediately because it's extremely complex. I mean, it requires essentially a whole stock exchange system in place for emission trading. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. So what you will need is, even if you want to go with an EU certifying body or someone to provide advice, you will need someone at the national level to help you to localize the advice so that it's compatible with what's going on in your own country. And in that sense, again, I think you guys will have to start talking with your trade associations and with the government, because the key point will be now to lobby so that you raise awareness that the overall economy starts to understand what's coming, so that there is a centralized solution, because you can do a lot voluntarily. And that's what we were talking about. And as I said, Galit is humble, but trust me, with Shibolet ESG, you're in the best possible hands. But the thing is that you, in addition to that, you will need a centralized approach from the government. I'm just checking. Oh, okay. So there's more. Sorry, the scroll doesn't go down. So Baruch has maybe a little political question, but can't avoid. How do you think the recent EU states buying of gas from Russia complies with ESG, the non-carbon part of it? And on a broader scope, do you foresee these directives as a potential tool for enforcing political positions in countries? Okay, so this is a fantastic question, both of them. I'll start with Galit. Do you want to jump in first?
No, I'm curious to what you have to say, because the business of buying gas from I mean, the gas situation and the fact that Europe is going to freeze is really, it's a question.
It's a great question. Okay, so let me start with the easier one, the second one, whether these directives and tools will be used for political positions. Absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it that, we'll see. But guys, I mean, this is something that we've been seeing when it comes to human rights topics for the last 50 years. I mean, the human rights, you had situations where the union was so high on principle when it comes to human rights, while you had other situations where, for example, women couldn't drive and that was no problem because it's a country who's an important trade partner. So, I mean, human rights are apparently very prone to economic considerations, let's put it that way. But I'm absolutely certain that there will be a part of these directives used as political tools. When it comes to Russian gas, that's a fantastic question. And it's not political anymore only, because now we have 8 packages of sanctions against Russia in the EU. And we actually have a 9th package that will be probably adopted this week. And interestingly enough, gas is still excluded from these sanctions. On the other hand, there is a European cap on gas prices and oil prices, which is a very unusual trade instrument because you're essentially capping someone else's price on something that they're selling, but you're still buying it. So it's a bit of let's say questionable measure, to put it lightly, even in terms of WTO rules. However, I think that I don't perceive that we'll see much of a change this year, not this fiscal calendar year, but this, let's say, business year, meaning this fall and until next spring. The big question will come when it comes to Russian gas and supplies next summer. Why? Because before these sanctions have become even more severe, which happened in the summer of 2022, the European Union countries were able to make significant gas reserves. So now rolling out these sanctions against Russia were not such a big issue because they did not affect gas supply and stability in the European Union. That said, now for next year, that will be a big challenge. And then next summer, when all of these countries start making their reserves, and when they see that, for example, if they don't meet the 60-70% threshold of reserves that you need by summer of gas, then we'll see what will happen. I think next year will be very interesting in terms of the whole Russian gas supply issue. Next year will be very interesting also in terms of a global recession potentially. And next year will be very interesting when it comes to how all of this will affect supply chains. And back to the initial or the key topic of our webinar, just imagine with all of this, the EU will be imposing a carbon tax on the border and 2 directives that will be extremely expensive for companies to apply, which will definitely again affect trade. So in short, we'll see. I think we'll have a very dynamic year. Let me check. So now I've scrolled everything. You're more welcome, Stephanie. Any other questions, anyone? No? Okay. I hope we haven't.
Very much, Bogdan. It was fascinating for me as well. I'm sure for everyone. Thank you. It was great. Thank you everyone for being here. We will send you the presentations, and both of Bogdan and myself. And if there are any questions, then you can for sure address us by email, and we will to Bogdan and to myself, and we will answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you. You were a fantastic audience, and thank you, Galit, for having us.
Thank you, Bogdan. Bye-bye.
Bye.